Tonight, we journey into the shadows, unraveling stories of terrifying encounters with entities from realms beyond. If you think you're brave enough, join us as we delve into accounts that defy logic and chill the soul. But beware! Each tale serves as a haunting reminder that some doors should remain closed. Title: The Whisper of the Forgotten Stairs. The streets of Pasadena glowed under soft winter lights as Emily Carter drove toward her aunt's house. The familiar colonial-style home, with its white siding and dark shutters, loomed at the end of the cul-de-sac. It was a house she had visited every winter break since childhood. Yet each return felt like walking into a place that aged faster than the world around it. Emily pulled into the driveway and stepped out, her breath visible in the rare chill of a Los Angeles winter. The warm laughter of her relatives spilled out from the house, a stark contrast to the creeping unease she couldn't quite place. She dismissed it as exhaustion from finals and pushed through the door to be greeted by a whirlwind of hugs and holiday cheer. April, her 4-year-old cousin, darted through the living room, her laughter piercing through the chatter. Emily's aunt, Karen, waved from the kitchen, a glass of wine in hand. "Emily, you've grown," Karen exclaimed, though it was a phrase she repeated every year. Emily smiled, soaking in the comfort of family. For now, the unsettling feeling was gone. The first 2 days passed uneventfully. Emily settled into the guest room on the second floor, catching up on sleep and indulging in the comfort of homemade meals. The house, though cozy, had its quirks. The groaning of the wooden floors, the faint draft that seemed to come from nowhere, and the way the upstairs hallway always felt a degree colder than the rest of the house. It was on the third evening that Emily noticed April's peculiar behavior. She was heading to the bathroom when she spotted April sitting on the stairs, her legs swinging as she made exaggerated faces. Emily paused, leaning against the banister. "What are you doing, kiddo?" Emily asked, amused. April looked up, her eyes wide with innocence. "I'm copying the lady with the braid." Emily frowned, glancing around the stairwell. The hallway behind her was empty, the only sound coming from the television downstairs. "What lady?" April pointed toward the wooden beam running parallel to the stairs. "She's right there," she said matter-of-factly. Emily followed the line of April's finger but saw nothing. "What's she doing?" April grinned, her small teeth showing. "Making funny faces, like this." She puffed her cheeks and crossed her eyes. Emily chuckled despite herself. "All right, you little goofball," she said, ruffling April's hair. She turned to head upstairs when April spoke again, her tone unsettlingly serious. "Her braids are around her neck." Emily froze mid-step. She turned slowly to face April, who now stared at the beam with unnerving focus. "What do you mean?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. April pointed again, her finger unwavering. "She's hanging by her braid. She's making funny faces." A chill ran down Emily's spine as April contorted her face into a grimace, her mouth slightly open, her eyes bulging. A disturbingly accurate mimicry of someone struggling to breathe. "April!" Emily snapped, her voice sharper than intended. April blinked, startled, then giggled. "You're funny, Em," she said, hopping off the stairs and skipping toward the living room. Emily stood rooted in place, her heart pounding. She glanced at the beam one last time before retreating upstairs, the laughter of her relatives echoing behind her. That night, Emily lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The events on the stairs replayed in her mind, each detail amplifying her unease. April's words, her expression. It didn't feel like the ramblings of a child's imagination. Unable to sleep, Emily grabbed her phone and began searching the house's history. It was something she had never thought to do before, but now curiosity gnawed at her. The house was built in the 1920s, a time when Pasadena was transitioning into the suburban haven it was now. Scrolling through digitized archives, Emily stumbled upon a local newspaper article from 1932. A grainy photograph accompanied the headline, "Tragedy Strikes Pasadena Home. Maid Found Dead in Apparent Suicide." The article detailed the story of Clara Roberts, a young maid employed by the house's original owners. Clara was found hanging from a beam in the stairwell, her long braids tied around her neck. The death was ruled a suicide, but whispers of foul play circulated in the community. Emily's stomach churned as she read. The image of the beam and April's innocent words collided in her mind, forming a picture she didn't want to see. The next morning, Emily couldn't shake the weight of what she had learned. She decided to keep it to herself, not wanting to alarm her aunt or uncle. But her concern for April grew when she noticed subtle changes in the child's behavior. April no longer played on the stairs. She avoided them entirely, taking the long way through the dining room to get to the living room. When Emily asked her why, April simply said, "The lady doesn't like it when I use the stairs." That night, Emily heard soft footsteps outside her door. She opened it to find April standing in the hallway, clutching a stuffed animal. "What's wrong, April?" April's eyes darted toward the staircase. "She's mad," she whispered. Emily knelt down, placing her hands on April's shoulders. "Why is she mad?" April hesitated, then leaned closer. "Because you saw her." Emily couldn't ignore it any longer. She decided to confide in her aunt, though Karen's reaction was dismissive. "April's always had a vivid imagination," Karen said, waving it off. She probably heard one of the old stories about the house. But Emily knew better. She began to notice things herself. Shadows that seemed to linger near the beam, cold drafts that felt too deliberate, and a faint creaking sound that echoed through the house at odd hours. One night, as she passed the staircase, Emily thought she saw movement in the corner of her eye. She turned sharply, her breath catching in her throat. For a moment, she thought she saw a figure. A woman, swaying gently as if suspended from the beam. When she blinked, it was gone. Determined to find answers, Emily delved deeper into the archives. She learned that Clara's employers had a history of mistreating their staff, and though no charges were ever filed, the rumors of abuse persisted for years. Emily began to suspect that Clara's death was no suicide. But why was she still here? And why had April, of all people, become her focus? That evening, as the family gathered for dinner, April suddenly screamed. She pointed toward the staircase, her face pale with terror. "She's there," April cried. "She's watching us." The room fell silent, all eyes turning toward the empty stairwell. Karen tried to soothe April, but the child refused to calm down. Emily's gaze lingered on the beam, her pulse racing. Whatever was haunting this house wasn't finished with them yet. The morning after April's outburst, the house felt different. Emily woke up to a quiet so heavy it seemed to press against her ears. Gone was the usual hum of holiday excitement. Even the occasional creaks of the old house seemed muted. At breakfast, Karen tried to reassure everyone. Kids have wild imaginations. April probably overheard something and worked herself up. But April, sitting quietly at the table, seemed different. Her usual chatter was absent, replaced by a solemn silence. Emily watched as April stared at her plate, occasionally glancing toward the hallway leading to the stairs. Emily leaned in. "Are you okay, April?" April hesitated, then whispered, "She's still mad." Emily felt a shiver travel down her spine. That evening, Emily struggled to focus on anything. She sat in the living room, half-heartedly flipping through a book, while the rest of the family watched a holiday movie. Her eyes kept drifting toward the staircase, the beam overhead looming in the periphery of her vision. By the time she went to bed, her nerves were frayed. The silence in the upstairs hallway felt oppressive. She checked on April, who was asleep clutching her stuffed animal, before retreating to her room. Hours later, Emily woke to a faint noise, a creaking sound, like footsteps. She held her breath, straining to listen. There it was again, closer this time. She slipped out of bed, her heart pounding, and opened her door just enough to peer into the hallway. The faint light from the night lamp illuminated the wooden floor, but the hallway was empty. Emily froze. The creaking hadn't stopped. It was coming from the staircase. Carefully, she stepped into the hallway, her bare feet silent against the cold wood. As she approached the top of the stairs, she saw it, the faintest movement, like the swaying of a shadow near the beam. She blinked, and it was gone. The next morning, Emily decided to confront Karen again. She explained what she had seen and the strange noises that had kept her awake. Karen sighed, rubbing her temples. "Emily, this house is nearly 100 years old. It makes noises. And shadows? That's just your mind playing tricks on you. The holidays are stressful." "It's not stress," Emily interrupted. "And it's not the house. Something's wrong, Karen. Can't you feel it?" Karen hesitated, her expression softening. "It's an old house, Em. It has its history, sure. But ghosts? Spirits? Come on." Emily wanted to argue but stopped herself. It was clear Karen wasn't going to take her seriously. Frustrated, Emily decided to dig deeper on her own. She began searching through the house, starting with the attic. It was a cramped, dusty space filled with forgotten belongings. Hours into her search, she found a small wooden box tucked behind a stack of old suitcases. Inside was a leather-bound diary. The handwriting was neat but faded, and the first page bore the name Clara Roberts. Emily's hands trembled as she flipped through the pages. Clara's words painted a picture of a life filled with hardship and loneliness. She wrote about her employers, the Thompsons, and the growing tension in the household. The final entries were the most disturbing. "Mrs. Thompson found me crying today. She told me to keep my head down and do my work. I overheard them arguing last night. I'm afraid of what might happen if I stay." The last entry was incomplete, the words trailing off mid-sentence. The diary raised more questions than answers, but Emily was determined to find the truth. She decided to explore the basement, a part of the house she had always avoided. The basement was cold and damp, the air heavy with the scent of mildew. Boxes and old furniture were piled haphazardly, and the single bulb overhead cast long, eerie shadows. Emily began searching through the clutter, finding nothing but broken toys and forgotten Christmas decorations. Just as she was about to give up, she noticed something odd. A section of the wall that sounded hollow when she knocked on it. She pushed against it, and the wooden panel gave way, revealing a small, hidden compartment. Inside was a bundle of letters, their paper brittle with age. The letters were from Clara to her sister, though it seemed they had never been sent. They spoke of mistreatment, fear, and a growing sense of despair. One letter, dated just days before her death, read, "I don't know how much longer I can endure this. I feel like I'm being watched, even when I'm alone. Last night, I heard someone on the stairs, but when I looked, no one was there. I don't feel safe here anymore." Emily's breath caught in her throat. The parallels between Clara's experiences and what she and April were experiencing now were too clear to ignore. That evening, Emily decided to share what she had found with her uncle, David. Unlike Karen, David was more open-minded and listened carefully as Emily laid out the evidence. "This is serious," David said, frowning. "But what do you want to do? Move out? It's the holidays, Emily." "I just think we need to be careful," Emily said. "And we need to keep April safe." David nodded, though Emily could tell he wasn't entirely convinced. As the days passed, the activity in the house escalated. Lights flickered, objects moved on their own, and the creaking on the stairs became a nightly occurrence. April began to complain of nightmares, describing the lady with the braid, standing at the foot of her bed. One night, Emily woke to the sound of a crash. She rushed into the hallway to find a picture frame shattered on the floor. April was standing nearby, her face pale and tear-streaked. "She's mad," April whispered. Emily scooped her up, her heart racing. She knew they couldn't stay in the house any longer. The family decided to spend the rest of the holidays at a nearby hotel. Karen was reluctant at first, but after the incident with the picture frame, even she couldn't deny that something was wrong. As they packed their things, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching them, as though it knew they were leaving. When they finally drove away, Emily looked back at the house one last time. The windows stared back at her, dark and unyielding. The family settled into the modest hotel a few miles from the house. The change of environment brought a sense of relief, but for Emily, it was fleeting. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the beam on the staircase, Clara's incomplete diary entries replaying in her mind. April, however, seemed lighter. She played with her toys and even laughed, a sound Emily hadn't heard in days. Emily couldn't help but wonder if the house itself had been the source of April's unease. Still, the unanswered questions gnawed at her. Who was Clara? What had happened to her? And why did April seem to be the only one who could see the lady with the braid? Determined to find answers, Emily decided to visit the local library the next morning. She left April in Karen's care and took a taxi to the city archives. The librarian, a woman in her 60s with a sharp gaze, was eager to help. The Thompson house, you say? That place has a bit of a reputation, she remarked. What kind of reputation? Emily asked, leaning in. The librarian lowered her voice. There were whispers, stories about a maid who hanged herself there decades ago. People said she was mistreated, driven to despair. Emily's stomach turned. Clara. With the librarian's guidance, Emily sifted through old newspaper clippings and property records. She found an article from 1934 with the headline, "Maid Found Dead in Prominent Family's Home." The article described Clara Roberts, a 24-year-old maid employed by the Thompsons, found hanging from a beam in the stairwell. The death was ruled a suicide, but neighbors and acquaintances suggested otherwise. She was a sweet girl, but she was scared of them. One anonymous source was quoted. She told me she wanted to leave, but they wouldn't let her. Emily's hands trembled as she read. The more she learned about Clara, the clearer it became that the house was steeped in a dark history. That evening, Emily shared her findings with Karen and David. She laid the documents on the small hotel table, her voice shaking as she recounted the details. Karen looked skeptical but concerned. David leaned back in his chair, his expression grim. So, what does this mean for us? David asked. It means the house has a history of tragedy, Emily replied. And maybe, just maybe, that's why these things have been happening. Karen folded her arms. I still think it's coincidence. April's imagination, the house creaking. It's all explainable. Emily shot her a frustrated look. Explainable? April saw something none of us did. She described Clara perfectly without ever knowing she existed. David raised a hand. Enough. Whether it's explainable or not, we need to decide what to do. Do we sell the house? Stay in the hotel forever? The room fell silent. Emily couldn't let it go. That night, after everyone else had gone to bed, she pulled out Clara's diary and reread the final entries. Something about the incomplete sentences nagged at her. She remembered the hidden compartment in the basement. Had she missed anything? The next morning, Emily drove back to the house alone. The thought of stepping inside filled her with dread, but she needed answers. The house was eerily quiet when she arrived. Dust motes floated in the air as she made her way to the basement. Her search was methodical this time. She emptied every box, checked every crevice. Finally, tucked inside a cracked porcelain vase, she found another bundle of papers. Letters that seemed to pick up where Clara's diary had left off. One letter stood out. They don't trust me anymore. Mrs. Thompson watches me constantly. Last night, I heard footsteps outside my room. I don't know what they want from me, but I'm scared. If anything happens to me, please tell someone the truth. The letter wasn't signed, but Emily knew it was Clara's handwriting. Emily brought the letters back to the hotel and spread them out on the bed. As she read, a disturbing pattern emerged. Clara had been planning to leave, but something, or someone, had stopped her. The idea that Clara's death wasn't a suicide but something far more sinister began to take root in Emily's mind. She called the librarian for advice. If I wanted to look into an old case like this, where would I start? The librarian suggested the police archives, though she warned that many records from that era had been lost or destroyed. The next day, Emily visited the police station. After some bureaucratic hurdles, she was granted access to the archives. She found a single file related to Clara's death. The report was brief, stating that the case had been closed as a suicide. But one detail caught her eye, a note from the investigating officer. The positioning of the body raises questions. Further inquiry recommended. Emily's pulse quickened. It seemed even the original investigator had doubts. Armed with her findings, Emily called another family meeting. This time, even Karen couldn't dismiss the evidence. "I think we need to report this," Emily said. "If Clara's death wasn't a suicide, someone needs to know." David frowned. "Report it to who? The police? They won't reopen a case from the 1930s. "Maybe not," Emily admitted. "But we can't just ignore it." That night, back at the hotel, Emily couldn't sleep. Her mind raced with thoughts of Clara, the house, and the unanswered questions. Around midnight, she heard a noise, a faint creak, like a door opening. She sat up, her heart pounding. The sound was coming from the adjoining room where April was sleeping. Emily rushed to check on her. The room was empty. "April?" she called, panic rising. She found April standing by the window, staring out at the street. "What are you doing?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. April turned, her expression blank. "She's waiting for you." Emily's blood ran cold. "Who's waiting?" she whispered. April pointed toward the direction of the house. Emily sat in the dimly lit hotel room, her pulse racing as April's words echoed in her mind. "She's waiting for you." The weight of Clara's story pressed on her, demanding closure. The fear in her chest didn't outweigh the pull of responsibility. She couldn't leave things unfinished. That night, she made a decision. She would return to the house, confront whatever remained there, and uncover the full truth. Karen and David protested when she told them. "It's too dangerous," David said. Karen added, "What could you possibly gain by going back there?" But Emily was resolute. "If we don't face this now, it will haunt us forever. Clara deserves to be heard." Emily arrived at the house close to midnight, her flashlight casting long shadows on the walls as she stepped inside. The air was heavy with an oppressive stillness, and every creak of the floorboards seemed amplified in the silence. She made her way to the staircase, the beam above looming in the dim light. She stood there for a moment, imagining Clara's final moments, her heart aching for the young woman who had suffered so much. "Clara," she whispered, her voice trembling, "I'm here to help you. Please show me what happened." Nothing stirred at first, but then, faintly, she heard a sound. A soft, almost imperceptible sobbing. It seemed to come from the basement. Emily hesitated, her flashlight shaking in her hand. But she forced herself to move, descending the creaky steps into the dark, musty basement. The sobbing grew louder as she reached the bottom. Her flashlight beam swept across the room, landing on the hidden compartment where she had found Clara's diary. The compartment was slightly ajar. Inside, she found something she had missed before. A small, tarnished locket. Inside the locket was a photograph of Clara, smiling and carefree, alongside a young man Emily didn't recognize. Suddenly, the sobbing stopped. The silence was deafening. Emily turned, her flashlight flickering, and froze. In the corner of the basement stood a faint figure, barely visible in the dim light. It was Clara. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow, but her expression wasn't one of malice. It was one of sorrow. "Help me?" Clara's voice whispered, barely audible. The vision faded as quickly as it had appeared, leaving Emily shaken but determined. She clutched the locket tightly and returned upstairs. Sitting at the dining table, she spread out all the evidence she had collected. The diary, the letters, the newspaper clippings, and now the locket. The pieces began to fit together, forming a clearer picture of what had happened. Clara had fallen in love with someone, likely the man in the photograph. But the Thompsons, her employers, had discovered the relationship and disapproved. The letters hinted at threats and control. Emily suspected they had pushed Clara to the brink, perhaps even staged her death to look like a suicide. Her heart pounded as she realized the full extent of the injustice. Clara's story hadn't ended with her death. It had been buried, forgotten. Emily knew what she had to do. The next morning, she contacted the local historical society, sharing everything she had discovered. She also reached out to the police, urging them to review the case. At first, her efforts met resistance. The case was old, the evidence circumstantial. But Emily's persistence paid off when a detective agreed to examine the findings. Weeks passed, and the investigation gained traction. Forensic analysis of the house revealed faint traces of rope fibers on the beam, inconsistent with a suicide. Witness statements from archived records painted a damning picture of the Thompson family's treatment of Clara. Eventually, the Historical Society held a public memorial for Clara, acknowledging her life and the injustices she had faced. Emily attended with her family, including April, who seemed lighter and more at peace. After the memorial, Emily returned to the house one last time. She stood at the foot of the staircase, the beam above now stripped of its sinister hold. "I hope you're free now," she whispered. As she turned to leave, she felt a gentle breeze brush past her. A feeling of warmth and release. For the first time in months, the house felt quiet, no longer burdened by its tragic past. Emily and her family decided to sell the house, ensuring it would go to new owners who understood its history. They returned to their lives, forever changed by what they had experienced. For Emily, the ordeal left a lasting mark. It taught her the importance of listening, to the whispers of the past, to the voices that others might dismiss. And though she would never forget Clara, she found solace in knowing that the young woman's story had finally been heard.